Hello, today we are going to take a look at how to create a basic counter in Excel that has a plus and a minus button. We'll also take a look at a slightly more advanced version that lets you control something like game speed on an Excel settings page. Let's get started. Okay, so to get started, let's just insert our text boxes. We're going to go illustrations, shapes, and we'll just put in a normal text box. And this is going to be our actual counter. So let's just put in there for now 10. We're going to center align everything. Let's put this to display. We'll make it nice and large. Maybe have it bold and italic. And let's also just make this right-click format shape. I'm going to have no fill and no line. I'm going to make it so that on the size properties we say do not move or size with cells. And then let's just get that to a more reasonable size. We've probably, for now, let's say we wanted this to be able to go up to 3 characters long, so it would need to be big enough to go up to 999 comfortably, which it does. That's absolutely fine. And for now, we'll start it with 10. I'm also going to remove the grid lines from Excel to make this look a little nicer, a little cleaner. That is obviously on the View tab. Grid lines you can tick and untick. If you want to do it with this keyboard shortcut, I use Alt-WVG. Now, in addition to this, we're also going to need our plus and minus buttons. To create those, I'm going to use the exact same kind of template shape. So I'm going to drag this while holding Control and Shift, just to create an exact copy. And we'll make this one the plus. Let's have this, so we don't need that to be italic. We can make it slightly smaller. And again, let's just draw this down to the size it kind of needs to be. And we'll put this here. We want to make sure that this kind of what will be a button doesn't overlap what's here. So really this needs to come across to the right slightly. So now you can see we can click on the button without clicking on this central piece. We'll do the same for a minus button. So I'm now going to drag this to the left and make it a minus. And then for these, let's just move them up slightly. Okay, so then we've got kind of how we want it to look in terms of having our plus minus buttons. Okay, so before we go any further, let's rename these objects. So I'm going to go Shape Format, Selection Pane. You can see at the moment by default they're just named text box 1, 2, and 3. This one we're going to have, well, this can be text counter. The buttons, let's have these called just button plus and button minus. Okay, so now we've got all our buttons set up correctly. So let's go into the code and get them to do something. I'm going to go to the Developer tab, Visual Basic. And in here I am going to insert a new module. Let's make this a little bigger. And first of all, let's create a function that will change the counter number. So let's have update count. And as an argument in, this will take the amount that you are incrementing or decreasing by. So let's think about what we need to do here. First of all, we're going to need to get the current value of the counter. Secondly, we then want to update it by whatever the increment has been given. And finally, we want to output the new value. So let's create a variable counter, and then let's set this to the counter from the screen. So sheet 1 shapes, we know we've called this text counter. And then to get into this, it's text frame 2, text range, and text. So that will pull what at the moment is the 10 that we see on the screen. Now let's do an update of the value. So the counter actually will equal the current value of the counter plus whatever increment has been given as an argument here. So if it's +1, it will update it +1. It may be minus. That would have the same effect. And then finally, we want to output the value, so put it back on the screen. So now we can go and access this in exactly the same way. Sheet 1 shapes, and again, text counter. Exactly the same path to get to that piece of text. And then we're just going to assign this to be the new counter value. So let's try and test that just in the immediate window down here. If we say update count and give it an argument of 1 and hit return, changes to 11 and 12, and you can see whatever value we give it here, 54, it will increase it by that amount or decrease it. So if we do -1, it takes it down 1 every time. So we've got the functionality there that we're after. We now need to assign that functionality to the plus and minus buttons. So let's create a new function and we'll just call it button click. And we'll assign the same function to both the plus and the minus. So first things first, we need to work out which button has been clicked. So let's create a variable called button name. And we'll get that button name by calling application.caller. That will tell us what button has fired this macro. And then we can just say, okay, if button name equals the plus button, then do something, else do something else. And what we want it to do when it's the plus button is we want to say, okay, call this update count function with the argument of 1. So that will be a +1. Otherwise, call this update count with an argument of -1. So now let's go back onto here and let's select each of the buttons, right click, assign macro, and we'll assign button click to both of them. So now the -1 will take it down by 1 and the +1 will take it up by 1. Now one common use of a plus-minus like this is on a settings page, perhaps if you're controlling something like game speed. So you might start at 1x speed, you might want to allow the user to take the speed down to 1/2 or 2x, 4x, 8x, etc. That gets slightly more complicated in terms of our method because we're adding in, well, an x for a start as a string, and we're also not just doing +1 or -1, we're talking about dividing or times in by 2. So as that's a little more advanced, let's take a look at how we would do it. So let's think about this. We would start our text counter at, say, 1x. And then let's go back to our code and work out what we would need to do to make this work properly. So let's say we'll have a new function that's just called update. Let's say we were doing it for game speed, update game speed. Again, we'll take in the same increment as an integer. And really we're going to want to do the same sort of thing. So let's just copy what we had up here into this new function and work out from here what needs to change. So first of all, getting the current value of the counter. Just realised that says value. Let's change those. Now, when we first pull this value, this is no longer going to be an integer. This is going to be a string. So let's say, okay, counter text as string. And let's assign this to be counter text. Now we want to pull the number from that text. So we know that piece of text is going to have a single x at the end of it. So we essentially want to take everything to the left of that text, of that x. So to do that, let's say, okay, counter is going to equal, it's going to be the left-hand side of what we've just assigned to be counter text. And the length that it's going to be the whole length of counter text minus 1, because we know that just the rightmost character is the x. So we're just going to take 1 off it and take the left characters. So for 1x, this will now equal 1. We then want to update it by the increment. So for this, if it's given a +1 or a -1, we're going to say, okay, that's 1 increment up or 1 increment down. So let's say if the increment is greater than 0, then we want to do one thing. Otherwise, we want to do something else. And the thing that we want to do, if the increment is greater than 1, is we want to say, okay, the counter is going to change and it's going to be counter times by 2. So it'll double the speed each time. So you'll go from 1x to 2x to 4x to 8x to 16x. Otherwise, we want to go down. So we're going to do the opposite. We're going to say, okay, counter divided by 2. And then we can get rid of this section here. And then finally, we want to output the new value. So on this, it's going to be essentially exactly the same thing, except we need to add the x on at the end. So we're going to use ampersand and have x. And that should now work for us. So let's just try it out in the immediate window down here. So I'm going to say update game speed now. So the -1, let's have a look. Get an error. And what is the issue? We've got counter should equal counter divided by 2. So let's try that again. So update by -1 takes us to 0x. Now, we've got an issue here, haven't we? The issue we've got is that we are dealing with integers here. So an integer cannot have anything with a decimal place in. So what we need to do is we need to change this counter to be a double. That should allow us to have a decimal place in. So let's go back to here and just change this back to 1x, so we've got a number to deal with. And then let's try again. -1 takes us to 0.5. And let's just see a +1 takes us back to 1. And then if we go again, 2, 4, 8. Okay, so that works as expected. So now let's adjust what our buttons do. And to do this, all we're going to do is, instead of calling update count +1, we're going to call this update game speed. So let's have this here and here. And then let's try that out. So on the plus, we're going to go 1632, etc. This gets too long when we get to 128, but I think the next step will be to limit how fast and how slow we want the user to be able to set the game. Because we can currently go all the way down, 0.5, and then again 0.25, we start getting too long in terms of characters. So what we'll try and do here is limit the user to say, okay, 0.5x is the minimum you can go to, and perhaps 16x is the maximum that you can go to. So to do that, let's go back to our coding screen and let's update on the update game speed. What we'll do is we'll check as we're updating this new value whether or not the user is at the limit of the lower limit or the upper limit. So let's say, Okay, if the counter, we want to check that as long as it's greater than or equal to 0.5, and we also want it to be less than or equal to 16, as long as it's in that range, then we're going to say update. And then at the end of here, we're just going to put the end if, because then otherwise it just won't do anything. So now when we update the speed, let's have a look. If we go up from 0.5, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, if I press the plus again, nothing happens. You can see kind of here the macro is firing, nothing's getting updated because that's the maximum. Same when we go down, get to 0.5, and we can't do anything else. Okay, so that's pretty much it for today. We've gone over how to use buttons to manipulate text and how to pull text and push text into shapes. If you've got any questions or comments, please add them below. Drop the video a like, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll see you next time.